Edward Hawthorne, a 70-year-old millionaire standing at the pinnacle of fame, thought he had buried love and the tears of his past beneath the dazzling lights of Chicago. But on one fateful night, a mysterious young man appeared, holding a faded photograph of a woman Edward had once sworn to love forever, and uttered the words that shattered his heart. "I am your son." Can a 45-year-old secret, a betrayed love, a forgotten child, rise from the ashes, or will it drown him in regret? Don't leave. Stay to uncover a story that will make you laugh, cry, and believe it's never too late to reclaim what was lost. Edward Eddie Hawthorne sat in his private office atop the highest floor of the Hawthorne Enterprises Tower, gazing down at the dazzling lights of Chicago. At 70, Eddie was a living icon of success, a millionaire CEO who had transformed his father's modest furniture manufacturing business into a global empire. His branded armchairs and sofas graced luxurious Hollywood mansions, five-star hotels in Paris, and even the White House. Fortune magazine once dubbed him the King of Comfort. But tonight, in the expansive room with its oak-paneled walls and the faint scent of cigar smoke, Eddie felt uneasy. He raised a glass of whiskey to his lips, the expensive liquor he'd learned to savor after decades of living in luxury. His hands, though marked by time with wrinkles and age spots, still carried the strength of a man who had once crafted his first chairs by hand in a small Indiana workshop. That was 45 years ago, when Eddie was a 25-year-old brimming with ambition, willing to sacrifice everything to escape a life of poverty. And he had succeeded, but the cost was the shattered pieces of a heart he tried not to remember. Tonight, the office was so quiet that Eddie could hear the ticking of the wall clock. He'd sent his assistant and security team home hours earlier, craving a rare moment alone. These days, solitude was a luxury he allowed himself, though he'd never admit it to anyone. Eddie Hawthorne, the man who'd once graced the cover of Time with a confident smile, was now just an old man living with memories he'd buried beneath stacks of contracts and money. The desk phone rang, cutting through his thoughts. Eddie frowned. He wasn't expecting a call, and only a handful of people knew his private number. With a sigh, he picked up the receiver, his deep, authoritative voice resonating. "Who's this?" On the other end was a young man's voice, slightly trembling. "I'm Michael Edward. I'm sorry for calling so late, but I need to see you. I think you might be my father." Eddie felt a jolt run down his spine. He set the whiskey glass on the desk, his hand trembling slightly. "You're mistaken," he said, his tone as firm as when he rejected billion-dollar buyout offers. "I don't have any children." He moved to hang up, but the voice on the other end stopped him cold. "I have proof," Michael said. "I have a photo and a letter from my mother. She passed away 2 months ago, and she told me to find you, Edward Hawthorne. I'm in the lobby of your building right now." Eddie leaned back in his chair, trying to stay calm. "You're in the lobby?" he repeated, his voice dropping. "All right, come up. Floor 48. I'll have security let you in." He didn't know what made him agree, perhaps curiosity or a gut feeling he couldn't explain. 10 minutes later, the office door opened, and a young man stepped inside. Michael Edward, about 45, was tall with dark brown hair and striking blue eyes. Eyes Eddie recognized instantly, though he didn't want to admit it. They were Lillian's eyes, the woman he'd once loved more than life itself. The woman he'd left behind in Indiana with a promise he never kept. Michael placed a small wooden box on Eddie's desk. Inside was an old, faded photograph. In it, a young, rugged Eddie, with a rare smile, stood beside Lillian, her gaze soft and warm. Eddie remembered that moment, the summer of 1978, when he thought his life was complete. But then he left, choosing dreams of wealth and power over family. He'd told Lillian he'd come back, but he never did. "Where did you get this?" Eddie asked, his voice hoarse. He picked up the photo, his fingers tracing Lillian's face. "My mother left it," Michael replied. "She had cancer, and before she died, she gave me this box. It had the photo, a letter, and a secret she said would change everything. She told me to find you because you're the only one who knows the truth." Eddie's heart pounded in his chest. He looked at Michael, searching for traces of Lillian in his face, and of himself. The secret he'd buried for 45 years now stood before him, alive and as clear as daylight. "Sit down," Eddie said, gesturing to the chair across from him. "What do you want from me?" Michael took a deep breath. "I don't want money. if that's what you're thinking. I just want the truth. My mother said I have a family she never told me about. And you're the missing piece." Eddie fell silent, his eyes fixed on the photo. The past he thought was dead had come back to life, bringing with it a question he wasn't sure he was ready to answer. Had he abandoned not just Lillian, but a son he never knew existed? Eddie Hawthorne sat motionless behind his desk, his gaze locked on the faded photograph Michael Edward had just placed before him. His vast office at Hawthorne Enterprises, usually a place where he felt most powerful, now seemed to shrink, suffocating under the presence of the young man sitting across from him. Michael, with those piercing blue eyes identical to Lillian's, was waiting for an answer, one Eddie wasn't sure he could give. He set the photo down, trying to reclaim the composure of a CEO who'd faced countless business crises. But this wasn't a contract negotiation or a lawsuit. This was his own past, alive and demanding attention. He cleared his throat, his deep voice breaking the silence. "You said your mother left a letter. What does it say?" Michael leaned toward the small wooden box, his hand trembling slightly as he opened it and pulled out a yellowed envelope. "I haven't read it all," he admitted, his voice hesitant. "My mother wrote it when she was very weak. She told me I should only open it with you, the man in the photo. I assume that's you." Eddie felt a wave of emotions surge in his chest, a mix of curiosity, fear, and something akin to regret. He nodded, signaling Michael to open the letter. Michael carefully tore the envelope, pulling out a fragile, folded sheet of paper with Lillian's shaky handwriting scrawled across it. He began to read aloud, his voice echoing in the room like an accusation from the past. "My dearest Michael," the letter began. "If you're reading this, I'm no longer here. I'm sorry for keeping this secret so long. You deserve to know the truth about your family and the man who left me, your father, Edward Hawthorne. He promised he'd come back for me and you, but he never did. I waited for decades, but I finally understood he'd chosen a different life. I didn't want you to grow up with resentment, but I couldn't let you live without knowing the truth. Find him, Michael. Ask him what." Each word of the letter pierced Eddie's heart like a dagger. He remembered those final days with Lillian, the summer of 1978, when he left Indiana with a promise to return once he'd made enough money to build a better life for them. But the dream of success swept him away. Months turned into years, and every time he thought to call Lillian, he convinced himself she'd moved on without him. He never knew about the child. Michael stopped reading, his eyes lifting to meet Eddie's. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice trembling with emotion. "Are you my father?" Eddie opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. He stood and walked to the large window overlooking Chicago, turning his back to Michael. He needed time to think, to piece together the fragments in his mind. "I don't know," he said at last, his voice rough. "I didn't know she was pregnant. Lillian never told me." Michael shot to his feet, the chair toppling behind him. "Don't know?" he nearly shouted. "You abandoned her. You abandoned us. And now you say you didn't know?" Eddie spun around, his eyes flashing with a mix of anger and pain. "You don't understand, Michael. I wasn't the man you think I was. I left because I had nothing, no money, no future. I wanted to come back, but then everything changed. I thought she'd forgotten me." "Forgotten you?" Michael repeated, his voice thick with bitterness. "She kept this photo for 45 years. She named me Michael Edward, after you. She never forgot." Eddie's legs felt weak. He leaned against the desk for support, his mind reeling. Lillian had named their son after him. She'd kept him in her life, if only through a name, while he'd spent his life erasing her memory. Michael stepped closer, placing the letter on the desk in front of Eddie. "I didn't come here to accuse you," he said, his tone softening slightly. "I just want the truth. If you're my father, I need to hear it from you. And if you're not, I'll leave right now." Eddie looked at the letter, then at Michael. Those eyes, Lillian's eyes, seemed to pierce through him, demanding an answer he couldn't evade. "I need time," he said, his voice low. "I can't answer you right now. Stay in Chicago a few days. I'll give you my assistant's number. She'll arrange a place for you." Michael shook his head, disappointment in his eyes. "I don't need your money or a fancy place to stay. I just need the truth. But if you need time, I'll wait. I'm at a hotel on Clark Street. You know where to find me." He turned and walked out, leaving Eddie alone with the letter and the photo. As the door closed, Eddie sank into his chair, his trembling hands picking up Lillian's letter. He read it again, line by line. as if the words could explain everything. But they couldn't. The past had returned, and it brought a question he could no longer avoid. Was he Michael's father? And if he was, what would he do with that truth? Eddie Hawthorne sat alone in his office after Michael left, the glow of Chicago's city lights streaming through the window, casting faint streaks across his face. Lillian's letter lay on the desk, an inescapable reminder of what he'd left behind. His mind swirled with memories he'd spent 45 years trying to bury. Lillian's laughter, the scent of fresh wood in his father's workshop, and the day he left Indiana with a tattered suitcase and a promise he never kept. Eddie picked up the phone and dialed Helen Carter, his personal assistant of 2 decades. Though it was nearly midnight, Helen answered immediately, her voice calm and professional as always. "Mr. Hawthorne, is something wrong? I need you to look into someone," Eddie said, his voice rough from whiskey and emotion. "Michael Edward, about 45 years old, currently in Chicago. I want everything. Who his mother was, where he was born, and anything tied to Lillian Parker from Indiana." Helen paused for a rare second, unusual for someone as quick as she was. "Are you sure, sir? This isn't standard business." "I'm sure," Eddie replied, his tone firm. "And Helen, this stays completely confidential. No one knows, not even the board." "Understood," Helen said. "I'll start first thing tomorrow. Do you want me to arrange anything for Mr. Edward?" Eddie hesitated. He recalled the disappointment in Michael's eyes as he walked out. "Let him stay at the hotel he picked. But keep tabs on him. I want to know what he does over the next few days." After hanging up, Eddie stood and walked to the liquor cabinet, pouring himself another whiskey. He didn't usually drink heavily, but tonight he needed something to quiet his chaotic mind. As the burn of the alcohol spread through his throat, memories of Lillian flooded back, sharper than ever. They'd met in the spring of 1977, when Eddie was 24 and Lillian had just turned 22. She worked at a small cafe in town, a spot Eddie frequented after long hours at the woodshop. Lillian had a smile warm as summer sunlight, and her blue eyes always made Eddie feel like the only man in the world. They fell in love quickly, fiercely, the way young people do. Eddie dreamed of a life with her, a small house, a couple of kids, a steady job. But then his father died, leaving the workshop drowning in debt, and Eddie realized he couldn't build a future from nothing. He left in the summer of 1978, after a long night with Lillian. "I'll come back when I have enough money," he'd said, kissing her forehead. Lillian nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she didn't stop him. Eddie thought that was the end, a sad but necessary goodbye. He never imagined she was pregnant, and she never reached out to tell him. The phone's ring jolted Eddie from his reverie. He frowned, glancing at the clock, nearly 1 a.m. He picked up, and Helen's voice came through, this time with a hint of urgency. "Sir, I did a quick check through the system. Michael Edward is registered at the Clark Inn, but there's something you need to know now. He's not alone. A woman's with him, about 60, named Ruth Parker. I found out Ruth is Lillian Parker's sister." Eddie's heart thudded. Ruth Parker. He remembered her, a tough woman who guarded Lillian like a lioness. Ruth had never liked Eddie, believing he wasn't good enough for her sister. If Ruth was here with Michael, it could only mean they knew more than they'd let on. "Can you dig up more on Ruth?" Eddie asked. "I'm trying," Helen replied. "But there's one more thing. Michael just made a call to the hotel from an Indiana number. It looks like he's in touch with someone back there. Should I dig deeper?" "Yes," Eddie said without hesitation. "And Helen, if Ruth Parker shows up here, I want to know immediately." As the call ended, Eddie sat down, cradling his head in his hands. Ruth's presence complicated everything. He began to wonder if Lillian had told her sister about the child, and if Ruth was the one behind Michael's search for him. It felt like a web from the past was tightening around him, and he wasn't sure he could break free. The next morning, Eddie arrived at the office earlier than usual. He hadn't slept, his mind haunted by Michael's face and Lillian's words in the letter. When Helen walked in with a coffee and a stack of files, he nearly leapt from his chair. "What did you find?" Helen set the files on the desk. Michael Edward was born March 15, 1979, in Indianapolis. His mother, Lillian Parker, registered his birth as Michael Edward, no father listed on the certificate. Lillian died 2 months ago from lung cancer, and Ruth Parker was Michael's only remaining guardian when he was young. It seems Ruth took care of him for a while after Lillian moved to Indianapolis. Eddie nodded, trying to piece it together. Anything else? Helen hesitated. There's something odd. In Lillian's hospital records, there's a note about an admission in early 1978, before Michael was born. Lillian was in a car accident and lost a fetus. The doctor noted she was about 3 months pregnant. Eddie felt the blood drain from his face. Lost a fetus? He repeated, his voice shaky. So Michael isn't that child, Helen said. Michael was born a year later. But if you're his father, it's possible Lillian was pregnant twice. The first time didn't survive, and the second was Michael. Eddie sank into his chair, his head spinning. Lillian had been pregnant even before he left, and he'd never known. He'd abandoned her not once, but possibly twice. And now Michael and Ruth were here, carrying pieces of a story he wasn't ready to face. Eddie Hawthorne stood in his office, clutching the stack of files Helen had just handed him, though his eyes remained fixed on the wide window overlooking Chicago. The morning sunlight streamed through the skyscrapers, but he felt a chill, as if winter had seeped into his very bones. The information Helen had provided about Lillian, the accident, the lost pregnancy, and Michael's birth, swirled in his mind, making it impossible to pretend it was all mere coincidence. The desk phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Eddie picked it up, and Helen's voice came through, urgent. Sir, Ruth Parker just arrived in the lobby. She's demanding to see you immediately. Michael's with her. Should I let them up? Eddie took a deep breath, feeling as though he stood at a crossroads with no way back. Let them up, he said, his voice low but resolute. And Helen, thank you. As he hung up, Eddie stepped toward the liquor cabinet, but stopped himself. He didn't want to face them clouded by alcohol. This time, he needed absolute clarity. He returned to his desk, sat down, and tried to steady his emotions. But before he could fully prepare, the office door swung open, and Ruth Parker strode in, followed by Michael. Ruth, now 65, still carried the steely resolve Eddie remembered from their days in Indiana. Her hair was silver and neatly tied back, and her sharp brown eyes bore into him as if they could set him ablaze. Michael stood behind her, his blue eyes tense, his hands gripping the small wooden box he'd brought before. Edward Hawthorne, Ruth began, her voice as cold as a winter wind. I never thought I'd see you again under these circumstances. But I'm not here for me. I'm here for Lillian, and for Michael. Eddie stood, striving to maintain his composure. Ruth, he said, nodding in greeting. It's been a long time. I didn't know you'd stayed close to Lillian all these years. Ruth scoffed, stepping closer to the desk. And you, Eddie? You vanished, leaving my sister with a broken heart and a child you never acknowledged. Did you think you could hide forever? Eddie felt the heat rise to his face. I didn't know she was pregnant, he replied, his voice rising in defense. Lillian never told me. If I'd known. If you'd known. Ruth interrupted, her tone cutting like a blade. You think that changes anything? You left, Eddie. You chose money and fame over family. Lillian waited for you for 2 years, wrote dozens of letters you never answered. She didn't even dare send them, afraid you'd reject her again. Eddie turned to Michael, who stood silently, his gaze flickering between Ruth and him. Do you believe what she's saying, Michael? Eddie asked, his voice softening. I'm not the complete abandoner Ruth makes me out to be. I loved Lillian, and I left because I wanted to give her a better life. Michael stepped forward, placing the box on the desk. I don't know who to believe, he said, his voice trembling. But I found this in my mother's things after she passed. It's not just the letter and the photo. There's something else you need to see. He opened the box and pulled out a small silver necklace, a simple piece of jewelry with a heart-shaped pendant. Eddie recognized it instantly. He'd given it to Lillian for her birthday in 1977, back when they were dreamers in Indiana. Inside the pendant, he'd engraved, Eddie and Lillian, forever. Eddie's hands shook as he took the necklace, his fingers tracing the faded inscription. She kept it, he whispered, tears welling in his eyes. After everything I did, she still kept it. Ruth stepped closer, her voice softening slightly. Lillian loved you, Eddie. Even in her pain, she never stopped loving you. But she didn't want Michael to grow up in the shadow of abandonment, so she never sought you out. She wanted to raise him on her own. But before she died, she told me Michael deserved to know who his father was. Eddie looked at Michael, overwhelmed by guilt and regret. What do you want from me, Michael? He asked, his voice hoarse. Money? An apology? I don't know what I can give you anymore. Michael shook his head, his eyes red. I don't want money. I want to know if you're my father. And if you are, I want to know why you weren't there when I needed you most. Eddie fell silent, his gaze shifting from Michael to Ruth, then back to the necklace in his hand. Finally, he took a deep breath and said, I'm not sure if I'm your father, Michael, but I'll find out the truth. I'll do a DNA test today, if you agree. I owe Lillian that, and I owe you. Ruth frowned but didn't object. Michael nodded, his voice quiet but firm. Okay, I agree. But if you are my father, I don't want you to disappear again. Eddie felt his chest tighten. He looked into Michael's eyes, Lillian's eyes, and nodded. I promise, he said, feeling, for the first time in decades, that his promise carried real weight. Ruth turned to Michael, placing a hand on his shoulder. Come on, she said. Let him do what he says. We'll wait for the results. As they left the office, Eddie sat down, still clutching the necklace. He called Helen immediately, asking her to arrange an urgent DNA test. Part of him hoped the results would deny everything, that he wasn't Michael's father, that he could go on with what remained of his life without facing the consequences. But a deeper part longed for the opposite. He wanted Michael to be his son, to have a chance to atone for the mistakes he'd made with Lillian. When Helen came in to collect his DNA sample, Eddie glanced out the window one last time, whispering to himself, Lillian, if you can still hear me, tell me what to do. Edward Eddie Hawthorne sat in the luxurious living room of his Chicago penthouse, the light from the fireplace dancing across his face. 3 days had passed since the confrontation with Ruth and Michael in his office, and the DNA test results, urgently arranged by Helen, now rested in a white envelope on the coffee table before him. Eddie had stared at it for over an hour, his hands trembling each time he reached for it. He had lived 70 years with the confidence of a man always in control, of million-dollar deals, of the furniture empire he'd built. But now, this fragile envelope held a truth that could upend everything he knew about himself. Eddie took a sip of whiskey, a habit he'd returned to after days of trying to stay sober, and told himself it was time to face it. With a deep breath, Eddie tore open the envelope and pulled out the paper inside. The black and white text stared back at him. Probability of paternity, 99.9%. His heart pounded, then seemed to stop for a moment, as if it too needed time to process the reality. Michael Edward was his son. Lillian had carried his child, and he had abandoned them both without ever knowing. Eddie buried his face in his hands, tears streaming down his cheeks, something he hadn't thought himself capable of after decades of suppressing emotion. He remembered Lillian's face, her smile, and the gentle voice that told him she believed in him. He'd betrayed that trust, not just once, but for 45 years. And now, Michael, the son he never knew he had, was out there somewhere in this city, waiting for him to keep his promise. The doorbell rang, startling Eddie. He quickly wiped his tears, stood, and walked to the door. Standing before him was Michael, alone, without Ruth. He wore a simple jacket, his blue eyes reflecting a mix of anxiety and hope. I got a message from your assistant, Michael said, his voice hesitant. She said the results were in, and you wanted to see me. Eddie nodded, opening the door wider. Come in, Michael. Sit down. We need to talk. Michael stepped inside, glancing around the penthouse with quiet surprise at its opulence. He sat in an armchair across from the fireplace, his hands clasped tightly, as if to steady his emotions. Eddie handed him the test results without a word. Michael skimmed the page, his eyes widening at the 99.9% figure. He set the paper down and looked up at Eddie. So it's true, he whispered. You're my father. Eddie sat across from him, nodding slowly. I'm your father, Michael, and I'm sorry for everything. I didn't know about you, but that doesn't change the fact that I was wrong to leave your mother. I made the wrong choice, and I've lived with that mistake my whole life without realizing how big it was. Michael sat in silence for a moment, his gaze fixed on the fire. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but clear. I don't know how to feel. Part of me is angry. At you, for my mom raising me alone, for how much she cried when I was little. But another part, I'm glad I finally know who you are. Eddie felt a spark of hope pierce through the pain in his chest. You have every right to be angry, he said. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But if you'll let me, I'd like to try. To be your father, even if it's late. Michael met Eddie's eyes, his expression softening. I'm not sure I'm ready to call you Dad, he said. but I want to know you better. My mom once said you were a good man, even though you left. I want to know the man she loved." Eddie gave a faint smile, feeling a relief he hadn't known in days. "I'll tell you," he said, "about your mom, about our days in Indiana, and the mistakes I made. But first, I have to ask, where's Ruth? I thought she'd come with you." Michael shrugged. "Aunt Ruth didn't want to. She said this was between you and me. She's still mad at you, but she told me to decide what I want from this." Eddie nodded, understanding that Ruth might never forgive him, and he didn't blame her. "She's right," he said. "This is about us. So where do you want to start?" Michael thought for a moment. "Tell me about the day you met my mom," he said. "I want to know how happy she was before everything changed." Eddie took a deep breath, letting the memories flood back. "It was a spring day in 1977. He began, his voice warmer than he'd expected. "I just finished making a wooden table in my dad's workshop, and I stopped by the cafe where your mom worked. She was wearing a green apron, her hair tied up, and when she smiled at me, I knew I was done for." Michael listened, his eyes lighting up as Eddie recounted the happy days with Lillian. They sat there for hours, talking by the firelight, slowly bridging the gap that 45 years had created. Eddie spoke of the nights they danced under the moonlight in Indiana, the times Lillian teased him for fumbling with wood scraps, and the future they dreamed of together, a future he'd shattered. As the clock struck midnight, Michael stood to leave. "Thank you," he said, his voice sincere. "I don't know where this will lead, but I'd like to see you again. Maybe tomorrow, if you're not busy." Eddie rose, extending his hand. "I'm never too busy for you," he said. "Tomorrow, I'll take you to lunch. We'll go from there." Michael shook his hand, the first handshake between father and son. As he left, Eddie stood by the door, watching Michael disappear into the elevator. He returned to the fireplace, picking up Lillian's necklace and holding it tightly. "I'm trying, Lillian," he whispered. "I hope you'd be proud." Edward, Eddie, Hawthorne stood before the mirror in the bedroom of his Chicago penthouse, adjusting a silk blue tie he rarely wore. Today was a special day, not a board meeting or a product launch for Hawthorne Enterprises, but the third lunch he'd had with Michael in the past week. At 70, Eddie never imagined he'd feel nervous about a meeting like this, yet the warmth in his chest was undeniable. A week had passed since the DNA test confirmed Michael as his son. In that time, Eddie and Michael had spent hours together, slowly building a bond neither had ever envisioned. Eddie had taken Michael to a small Italian restaurant he loved, where they talked about simple things, Michael's fondness for baseball and Eddie's stories of playing in high school. They laughed, sometimes sat in silence, but each moment felt like a gift Eddie hadn't known he'd missed for 45 years. Today, Eddie had something special planned. He'd called Helen, asking her to arrange a short trip to Indiana, where it all began. He wanted to take Michael back to the small town where he and Lillian had fallen in love, to show him a piece of the past Lillian had left behind. As Eddie stepped out of the penthouse and into the lobby, he saw Michael waiting, dressed in a brown fall jacket, offering a slight smile when he spotted him. "You look different," Michael said, eyeing Eddie's tie. "I've never seen you dressed like this." Eddie chuckled, a relaxed laugh he rarely let slip before. "Today's not like other days," he replied. "Get in the car. I've got something to show you." Eddie's sleek black sedan, driven by his personal chauffeur, whisked them out of Chicago and toward Indiana. On the way, Eddie shared more stories about Lillian, how she'd hum folk songs in the kitchen, or the time she made a burnt apple pie they ate anyway to spare her feelings. Michael listened, his eyes lighting up with each glimpse of his mother through Eddie's eyes. When they reached the small Indiana town, Eddie directed the driver to stop in front of an old, weathered wooden house, worn by time, but still familiar. "This is where I grew up," Eddie said, stepping out of the car, "and where I first met your mom." Michael gazed at the house, then turned to Eddie. "I never knew she grew up around here. She rarely talked about her past." Eddie nodded, leading Michael down a path to the back, where a massive oak tree still stood tall. "We used to sit under this tree," he said, his voice softening with memory. "I carved our names into it, Eddie and Lillian. I'm not sure if it's still there, but—" Michael stepped forward, bending to inspect the trunk. After a moment, he called out, "Here it is." He pointed to a faint carving, faded by time but still legible, E and L. Eddie approached, his hand brushing the etching. "She was everything to me," he whispered. "I was a fool to think leaving was how I'd prove my love." Michael placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder. A simple gesture, but heavy with meaning. She loved you, he said. I know that from how she kept your things, the photo, the necklace. She never blamed you, even though she had every right to. Eddie turned to Michael, his eyes misting with tears. You're more like her than you realize, he said. Not just the eyes, but the heart. I don't deserve you, but I thank the heavens you're here. They stood there for a while beneath the oak, letting past and present meld together. Then Eddie led Michael to the town's small cemetery, where Lillian was buried. He'd asked Ruth about the location over the phone, and though she remained curt, she'd allowed Eddie to visit. At Lillian's grave, Eddie knelt, placing a bouquet of white daisies, her favorite, on the headstone. I'm sorry, Lillian, he said, his voice choked. I didn't keep my promise, but I'm trying to make it right. Thank you for Michael, for giving me a chance I don't deserve. Michael stood beside him, quietly resting a hand on the stone. Thanks, Mom, he whispered, for letting me find him. As they left the cemetery, the sunset painted the Indiana sky golden. Eddie turned to Michael, his voice steadier than ever. Would you consider staying in Chicago for a while? He asked. I've got an empty apartment, and I'd like you closer. We've got so much time to make up for. Michael smiled, his grin fully relaxed for the first time. I'll think about it, he said. But either way, I want us to keep meeting. I don't want to lose you again. Eddie nodded, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. You won't lose me, he promised. Never again. On the drive back to Chicago, Eddie gazed out the window, his hand clutching Lillian's necklace in his pocket. He thought of the years ahead, not just days of work and solitude, but days with Michael, with the family he'd finally reclaimed. When the car pulled up to the penthouse, Eddie turned to Michael. Tomorrow, I want you to meet my team at Hawthorne Enterprises, he said. Not to work, but so they know I have a son. I want the world to know about you. Michael laughed, a sound Eddie knew he'd never tire of hearing. All right, he said, but you'll have to teach me how to tie a tie first. Eddie laughed too, and for the first time in decades, he felt truly alive. Not as a millionaire CEO, but as a father, a man who'd rediscovered his heart through the love Lillian had left behind.